Mr. Larson and American Studies presents The Spanish-American War, Forcing Our Face Onto the Future. Help from Mr. Review. No fancy words, no fancy suits, plain talk about issues you need to know. Just in time. 1890s America. The nation headed full speed into a new industrial age. At the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, millions gathered to celebrate the innovations that powered American productivity. Incandescent lights, efficient farming methods, modern railways, a faster printing press. Visitors could even taste the promise of the next century. Cracker Jacks, diet soda, and the hamburger made their American debut. Only a few days after the fair opened, the nation was hit by the worst financial crisis in its history. Stocks plummeted, businesses went bankrupt, and millions of Americans lost their jobs. In a lecture at the exposition, the young historian Frederick Jackson Turner suggested that the solution for the United States could be found beyond its borders. The Spanish Empire was waning and weakening. Many in the U.S. saw an opportunity. Revolution began anew in 1895 under the visionary leadership of José Martí. Martí was a Cuban poet and journalist living in New York. He visited Cuban communities across the United States to promote and raise funds for Cuban independence. His ideas reshaped Cuba Libre. A new Spanish colonial governor, General Valeriano Weyler, was sent to Havana to stop General Gomez. Weyler faced a rebel army that operated with the support of peasant farmers. He forcibly reconcentrated the rural population. Weyler is a fiendish despot, a brute, a devastator of haciendas, pitiless, cold, an exterminator of men. There is nothing to prevent his carnal brain from inventing torture and infamies of bloody debauchery. So wrote the New York Journal, February 1896. The journal's new editor was William Randolph Hearst, the 33-year-old son of a successful California gold miner. Hearst had purchased the failing journal in 1895. He quickly made it the most influential newspaper in New York. Hearst took up the Cuban independence movement as a jingoistic way to bring America together. We were a nation in that period that was at each other's throats. North was still angry at South. Populist farmers didn't like East Coast bankers. We had economic depression, which created a panic. And Hearst saw that the way to pull everyone together was with some war. U.S. businessmen saw war as a threat to their investments in Cuba and to economic recovery at home. Their concerns were shared by Republican President-elect William McKinley. As governor of Ohio, McKinley had pushed for a stronger tariff to restore the nation's prosperity. He declared his stance on Cuba in his 1897 inaugural address. "We must avoid the temptation of territorial aggression. War should never be entered upon until every agency of peace has failed. I should welcome almost any war, for I think this country needs one. If we lose our virile, manly qualities and sink into a nation of mere hucksters, then we shall indeed reach a condition worse than that of the ancient civilizations in the years of their decay." So said Assistant Secretary of the Navy Theodore Roosevelt. Assistant Secretary of the Navy Roosevelt was a tremendous admirer of Admiral Alfred T. Mahan, the president of the Naval War College. Mahan's books and articles pushed for a stronger Navy. Theodore Roosevelt and other people in the Navy Department understood that although the cause of war was the situation in Cuba, the war would be against Spain. And anything Spain could bring to bear in that war would be something that American forces should attack. The Spanish fleet was located in the Philippines. The Philippines had harbors that were worthwhile. The Philippines commanded the water routes between China and Southeast Asia. So to the few people, the Philippines meant something. On January 24, 1898, President McKinley ordered the battleship Maine to Havana to protect U.S. interests on the island. Spain's ambassador to Washington, Enrique Dupuy de Lome, was unimpressed with McKinley. A letter Dupuy de Lome had written to a friend in Havana was intercepted by Cuban revolutionaries and offered to the New York Herald. McKinley is weak and catering to the rabble, and besides, a low politician who desires to leave a door open to the jingoes of his party. The New York Herald needed a day, at least, to authenticate the letter. The Cuban said, "You don't have a day." They took it to Hearst. Hearst published it immediately with huge headlines. "Greatest insult ever to America. Spanish insult our president." And the Hearst papers now demanded, and other papers as well, that war was our only recourse. On February 15, 1898, an explosion rocked the Maine, which had been moored for 3 weeks in Havana Harbor without incident. The explosion aboard the Maine killed 266 U.S. soldiers. The dead would be given a hero's burial in Arlington National Cemetery. The McKinley administration appointed a naval committee to investigate the cause of the tragedy. Many Americans had already made up their minds. The final push came on March 25th when the naval committees investigating the Maine explosion reported its findings. The explosion had been caused by a submerged mine. Though the report never fixed responsibility, few doubted that the Spanish were to blame. On April 11th, President McKinley addressed Congress. "In the name of humanity, on behalf of endangered American interests, I ask Congress to authorize the President to take measures to secure a final termination of hostilities and a stable government." Cuban rebel sympathizers in New York were enraged. There was no clear endorsement of Cuban independence. Senator Henry Teller proposed an amendment that would appease Cuban rebels. The United States disclaims any intentions to exercise control over Cuba, except for pacification, and asserts that, when that is accomplished, to leave the island to its people. On April 22nd, President McKinley ordered Rear Admiral Sampson to blockade Havana. Spain responded to U.S. naval maneuvers with a declaration of war. Congress immediately followed suit. Just after midnight on May 1, 1898, Commodore Dewey's flagship Olympia entered Manila Bay. Dewey's 9 ships, modernized to compete with the navies of Europe, had yet to be tested in battle. Commodore Dewey's squadron made 5 devastating passes at the Spanish fleet. By noon, the Spanish had surrendered their naval base in Manila Bay. 10 Spanish ships were destroyed. 1 U.S. sailor was killed. When President McKinley called for 200,000 volunteers, more than 1 million Americans responded. There is no division in any part of the land. North and south, east and west, all alike cheerfully respond. From cap and campaign there comes magic healing, which has closed ancient wounds. So said President McKinley. Theodore Roosevelt resigned as Assistant Secretary of the Navy when he received his commission to fight in Cuba. Roosevelt joined the 1st United States Volunteer Cavalry, nicknamed the Rough Riders. With a few experienced officers to train them, the volunteers were unprepared for what lay ahead. Images of U.S. soldiers preparing their advance were captured by a cameraman sent to Cuba by Thomas Edison. The size of early cameras prevented the filming of actual battles, so Edison shot reenactments in New Jersey. In reality, U.S. soldiers were unready for their first encounter with the Spanish. 27-year-old author Stephen Crane, a reporter for the New York World, marched alongside Colonel Theodore Roosevelt and his Rough Riders. They reached Las Guasimas, 3 miles north of Siboney, on June 24th. Coming out of the Depression, all the news had been bad news, and here came a war, and it was a glorious war to cover. Exotic place, an enemy that was easy to despise, real heroes, all the color of the Rough Riders. Suddenly above the cracking of the carbines rose a peculiar drumming sound. "It's the Gatlings! Men, our Gatlings!" Colonel Theodore Roosevelt barked. The Spanish had never seen this kind of weapon before, but it scared them because it was, hundreds of rounds a minute pouring into their positions, and it didn't take long before they just turned, tail, and ran down the other side of San Juan Hill. U.S. forces captured the San Juan Heights at the cost of 140 American men, but history would assign the glory to only one. The number one image of the Spanish-American War in the minds of the American people is Teddy Roosevelt on his horse, standing out there all by himself. Spanish sharpshooters up there shouting at him, obviously the most visible target by far, on the battlefield, telling his guys not charge, but follow me. Under the shade of a great ceiba tree, General Shafter began negotiations for the surrender of Santiago. As commanding general of the army, Nelson Miles had warned President McKinley disease struck U.S. soldiers. He knew, and it was certain, and in fact it did happen, that virtually all of the American troops are going to get malaria. And as many as 25% of them would be down at any one time, and by down I mean flat on their backs, unable to operate at all. And then in July, the yellow fever was going to start. The growing death toll convinced General Shafter to accept a conditional surrender of Santiago. Spain could not afford to ship its own army back from Cuba. Shafter agreed to send 23,000 Spanish soldiers at U.S. expense. Disease would take the lives of more than 2,000 U.S. troops, nearly 5 times the number of fatalities from combat. Peace negotiations between the United States and Spain began in Paris on October 1, 1898. No Filipinos or Cubans had been consulted or invited to attend. Their fate lay in the hands of 10 American and Spanish delegates. Spain accepted the U.S. offer and gave up Philippines and Cuba, in addition to Guam and Puerto Rico. The 400-year-old Spanish Empire, which once included most of the Western Hemisphere, ended with the stroke of a pen. The Treaty of Paris, signed on December 10, 1898, required ratification by at least 2/3 of the U.S. Senate. Despite the overblown rhetoric on both sides, there was a critical issue that was being debated. Should the United States become an imperial power? Greg Hoare argued, "This treaty will make us vulgar, commonplace empire, controlling subject races and vassal states, in which one class must forever rule and other classes must forever obey." Newt Nelson argued, "Providence has given the United States the duty of extending Christian civilization. We come as ministering angels, not despots." George Vest stated, "Every schoolboy knows that the Revolutionary War was fought against colonial systems of Europe. No power is given to the federal government to acquire territory to be held as colonies." Henry Cabot Lodge said, "Suppose we reject the treaty. We continue the state of war. We repudiate the president. We are branded as people incapable of taking rank as one of the world's greatest powers." William Jennings Bryan argued, "When the desire to steal becomes uncontrollable, in an individual he is declared to be a kleptomaniac. When the desire to grab land becomes uncontrollable in a nation, we are told that the currents of destiny are flowing in the hearts of men." Robert Beisner, "They don't think it's possible for a democracy to be an empire, that trying to rule an empire thousands of miles abroad, they're convinced will corrupt American democratic institutions. But they also can't imagine absorbing the people of the Philippines in any form into the American Republic." Businessman Andrew Carnegie said, "Is the Republic to remain one homogeneous whole, one united people, or to become a scattered and disjointed aggregate of widely separated and alien races?" The Senate narrowly ratified the treaty. The United States officially acquired its first colonies and its first colonial rebellion. 60 U.S. soldiers and 700 Filipinos had been killed. One of the great sardonic writers of the time, Ambrose Bierce, wrote that taking an empire is not like smoking a cigarette. The people who came to be known as anti-imperialists were of that view, and one of them said, "Dewey took Manila with the loss of one man and all our institutions." Insurgents in both Cuba and the Philippines continued to fight. American troops were not withdrawing. Independence was not granted. The body count in the Philippines worried President McKinley. 3,000 Americans and 15,000 Filipinos had been killed. U.S. generals in Manila were ordered to censor reporters' dispatches that contained any unfavorable news. Nevertheless, McKinley won re-election in 1900. One of the first acts of McKinley's new administration was to offer Cuba limited self-government. The Platt Amendment, introduced by Connecticut Senator Orville Platt, made Cuba a U.S. protectorate. The United States could intervene in Cuba's affairs and establish a naval base at Guantanamo Bay. The Platt Amendment was the American guarantee that Cuba would remain American. It undermined any attempt on the Cubans to be autonomous. "We have a vast and intricate business built up through years of toil and struggle," McKinley argued, "in which every part of this country has its stake. Isolation is no longer possible or desirable. He was the first president who had ever said this, who had essentially told Americans that they now had global responsibilities and that they had to start learning foreign languages because they were now competing in a world market. McKinley's words at the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, New York in September 1901 would make history. So too would Leon Sogolos. Leon Sogolos, an anarchist, had fired a revolver concealed by a handkerchief. One bullet deflected harmlessly off a button on the president's shirt. The second lacerated his stomach. President William McKinley died 8 days later. Vice President Theodore Roosevelt was sworn in as his replacement. In April 1902, after more than 3 years of fighting, Filipino insurgents surrendered to the United States. By the end of the war, Americans simply had no stomach for any more colonies. Even Roosevelt himself was forced to conclude that the Americans were not an imperial people. He said the Philippines had become America's Achilles heel. He should have listened harder in 1898 to a lot of people who were saying at that time, "We're going to acquire these foreign people about whom we know very little or nothing, who are way, way far away, who have a culture that is not part of ours. It's just south of Japan. They're gone. If we have those islands, it's going to draw us into a war in the Pacific, and it's going to be a very bloody and very tough war to fight." In World War II, Japan conquered the Philippines. 60,000 Americans and more than 1 million Filipinos were killed driving the Japanese from the islands. Soon after, the United States granted the Filipinos their independence. The U.S. military withdrew from Havana in 1902. While the Cubans could govern their day-to-day affairs, the Platt Amendment allowed the United States to intervene whenever its interests were threatened. Cuba was given its independence in 1934, but the United States remained a powerful influence in the island's affairs. Resentment in Cuba grew, culminating in another nationalist revolution. Fidel Castro, the son of a Spanish sugar planter, overthrew U.S. black-backed dictator Fulgencio Batista in 1959. It is not coincidence that in their final hours of the fall of the Batista government, Fidel Castro on January 1st issued a proclamation talking about the fall of the regime, and then makes this remarkable allusion, that this time the Cuban army will not be kept out of the city of Santiago, a resonating reference to 1898. It is as if somehow now Cuba and Cubans' history, in some sort of existential way, has resumed. To the Maine Memorial in Havana, Castro's government added an inscription, "To the victims of the Maine who were sacrificed by imperialist greed in its mission to conquer the island of Cuba." In 1911, the Navy decided that it was not what they wanted to have the Maine on the bottom of Havana Harbor with its superstructure sticking up out of the water, and they thought it would be more seemingly to refloat the Maine and take it out to sea and sink it there. And that's where things stayed until the 1970s, when the late Admiral Rickover came up with the conclusion that it was not an external explosion, but that it was probably set off by a spontaneous combustion fire in the coal bunker. It's ironic because the explosion set off this series of events and changed us in ways that could never be reversed. Through force, America had planted its face around the world. Today, we still debate our role. The question is, will our face continue to be a force? You've been listening to Mr. Larson and an American Studies production on the Spanish-American War, with help from Mr. Review. No fancy words, no fancy suits, plain talk about issues you need to know. Just in time.